The wind came off the ridge like a knife, slicing through Clay Mercer's threadbare coat as he stood in the frozen prairie, staring at the shape beneath the linen. The bundle barely moved in the creaking cart behind him, but it wasn't supposed to. The town of Red Hollow had declared her dead. Clay shifted his weight, shovel in hand, boots crunching into the frozen earth. He was a tall, gaunt figure, all angles and sorrow, the sort of man the world had stopped seeing years ago. His face was leathery and grim, framed by graying whiskers that hadn't known a razor since last harvest. There was no one to shave for now. Not since Lorna. They'd paid him $2 to dig the grave and bury the girl. Fever took her, the sheriff said, with that quick glance of someone who didn't want to answer questions. Family passed weeks ago. She's got no one. Just needs putting in the ground before the wolves get curious. Clay had nodded once, silent. He wasn't a man of many words. Words hadn't done him any good when Lorna coughed blood into his hands, or when the bank man came with paper and pity in equal measure. Now, all he had was a few acres of snow-covered failure and a mule that walked like it had already given up. The girl hadn't looked dead when they brought her out, too warm, too whole. But Clay hadn't said anything. Wasn't his place. He wasn't the sort of man folks listened to anyway. He drove her out past the tree line, where the land dipped into a hollow that used to be a creek before the drought. He chose that place because it was quiet. No one would come out this far, not even the wolves. There were no birds. Just silence and the distant, eternal ache of the wind. The ground was half frozen, hard as stone in places. He'd only made it a few feet deep when he heard it. A breath. He stopped. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks. But there it was again, a rasping whisper. He turned slowly, muscles locked. The linen moved. He dropped the shovel. Clay approached the cart with cautious steps, heart hammering. The girl's chest rose again, so faint he might have missed it. Then her lips parted. "I ain't dead, am I?" she whispered. Clay stared at her. His first thought was that this was some cruel twist, some phantom of grief come to mock him. But no, she was alive. Her eyes, blue dazed, looked right through him. "No," he said, voice gravelly with disbelief. "No, you ain't." She tried to lift her head but barely managed a twitch. Her limbs trembled under the cloth. "You were supposed to be dead," he said, more to himself than to her. She blinked once, her mouth dry and cracked. "Cold." Clay didn't hesitate. He lifted her from the cart, surprised by how light she was. Her hair, damp with sweat, stuck to her cheeks. He wrapped her in the wool blanket from under the seat, turned back toward the mountains, and started walking. He should have gone to town. That's what reason would say. The doc was there, maybe even some medicine. But if someone had gone through the trouble of declaring her dead when she wasn't, Clay figured it wasn't fever that was trying to kill her. That thought hardened his jaw. The girl had been tossed aside like garbage, and he couldn't stomach the thought of turning her back over to the same hands. The trail to his ranch was long and crooked, lined with brittle trees and broken fences. His mule plodded ahead, cart now empty, its wheels creaking like weary bones. Clay carried the girl in his arms, adjusting her every few steps when she stirred or groaned. The sky bruised to a deep violet as twilight crept in. Snow began to fall, not heavy but steady. Cold seeped into his boots, up his legs, into the hollow place in his chest that grief had carved out. At the edge of his land, the cabin came into view. It leaned to one side like it was tired too, smoke long absent from the chimney. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and laid the girl on the cot by the fireless hearth. She shivered violently. Her lips moved but made no sound. Clay moved fast, faster than he had in months. He threw open the woodbox, empty. Of course it was. He cursed under his breath, grabbed his hatchet, and stepped out into the snow. By the time he returned, arms full of split pine, the girl was barely conscious. He knelt by the stove, coaxed a flame from the last of the oil and kindling, and fed it steadily. The fire caught, warm and crackling. The cabin began to thaw. He warmed water, soaked cloths, pressed them to her forehead. She twitched, murmured something unintelligible. He sat back finally, watching the fire reflect in her pale skin. She didn't look much older than his Liza would have been, had she lived. A thought struck him. Maybe that's why he'd turned around. Maybe saving this girl felt like making peace with the ghosts that haunted him. As the hours passed, her breathing grew steadier. The fever held on, but her body fought back. Sometime near midnight, she opened her eyes again. "You're the one they sent to bury me," she said, voice still raw. Clay nodded. "Suppose I am." She looked around, eyes resting on the fire, the walls, the cracked window pane, and then back to him. "I remember voices. Then darkness. Then snow. You don't remember how you got sick?" She blinked slowly. "I wasn't sick." Clay leaned in. "What do you mean?" Her lips parted, but she hesitated. The fire hissed softly. Then she whispered, "They tried to poison me. The man I was supposed to marry, his brother, maybe more. I had money coming from my father's estate. They wanted it gone." Clay felt the world shift under his feet, like the snow outside had given way to ice. "You sure about that?" She nodded, eyes sharp now despite the weakness in her limbs. "They thought it worked. They told the town I died. Paid the sheriff off, I think." Clay stood, paced once. He looked out the window into the blackness. Nothing but white and wind. "They'll come looking," she said. "If they find out I'm alive." "They won't," Clay said, without turning around. "You don't even know my name." He turned back, his expression unreadable. "Don't need to, not yet." She smiled faintly, a smile made of sadness and relief. "It's Juniper." Clay nodded. "Clay." Her eyes lingered on him. "You didn't bury me. Why?" He thought about Lorna again. About the grave he'd dug for her, and how he'd sat by it all night in the cold, because he couldn't bring himself to cover her up. "Because you opened your eyes," he said quietly. "And I figured maybe I wasn't meant to put another soul in the ground today." Juniper's eyes slipped shut again, but this time she didn't look like she was fading. She looked like she was resting. Clay stoked the fire, then pulled a chair up beside her bed. Outside, the storm rolled in full, burying the world in white. But inside the cabin, two lives refused to be buried. Not yet. Morning came cloaked in silence, save for the fire's low crackle and the faint whistle of wind squeezing through chinks in the cabin walls. Clay stood outside, axe in hand, breath fogging in the bitter air. Each strike of the blade bit through memory as much as timber. For the first time in a long while, he had a reason to split wood faster than the cold could creep in. Inside, Juniper stirred beneath the patched quilt. Her skin was less pale, her breath steadier. The fever had broken overnight, but strength didn't return all at once. It lingered at the edges of her bones, waiting to be coaxed back with warmth and time. She opened her eyes to the scent of broth and a man humming low, tuneless notes as he ladled soup into a dented tin cup. Clay turned when he saw her awake, his eyes cautious but not unkind. "Figured you'd be hungry." Juniper nodded, voice too weak to answer. She managed to lift her head enough to sip the broth, each swallow reviving her inch by inch. They didn't speak much that morning. Words felt fragile in the quiet, like they might break something delicate if spoken too soon. But there was no awkwardness. Just the steady rhythm of survival, a man and a woman, strangers tied together by coincidence and something heavier. By late afternoon, Juniper could sit up. She watched Clay repair the stove's vent pipe with a strip of flattened tin and wire, hands practiced but scarred. "You live out here alone?" she asked, her voice raspier than she remembered. "Just me now," he replied without looking up. "Used to be more." She heard the weight in his voice and knew better than to press. Her gaze dropped to her lap. "I used to think I'd never be alone," she said softly. "But people surprise you." Clay set his tools down. He rubbed his palms against his pants and turned to her. "You remember any more?" She nodded. "I was staying with the Whitlocks, cousins on my mother's side. They offered to keep me after Pa passed. Said I'd have a place, a future. But they had plans, ugly ones. Her fingers gripped the edge of the blanket. One night I overheard them arguing. About the inheritance. How I was a liability. Next morning, I took sick after breakfast. Never felt anything like it, weak, dizzy, burning. Then I was gone. Clay listened, jaw clenched. He remembered the sheriff's quick words, the way no one questioned a death in that house. If they know you're alive, they'll come, Juniper finished for him. Clay nodded. Then we don't let them find you. She looked at him, really looked. Why are you helping me? He hesitated. I don't know. Maybe because someone should have helped sooner. Maybe because you remind me of someone. Your daughter. Clay's eyes flickered to the mantel where a small, dust-covered photo Saturday yet. She passed. Fever took her too. Juniper didn't speak, but her hand reached out and rested near his on the table, not touching, but close enough to say she understood. For 3 days they fell into a rhythm. Clay hunted rabbits, chopped wood, and mended whatever in the house could still be fixed. Juniper grew stronger, walking a little each day, voice steadier, hands less shaky. They spoke more, but not too much. The silence between them had grown companionable, even necessary. One evening, Juniper stood outside the cabin, wrapped in a shawl. The sunset spilled amber across the snow, the trees glowing like ghostly sentinels. Clay joined her, leaning against the doorframe. Storms moving east. Might thaw soon. Do you think they've forgotten me? He didn't answer immediately. No. Men like that don't forget what they think they own. Juniper turned to him. Then I can't stay. His jaw flexed. You can't run either. Not like this. You leave now, you die before you hit the ridge. She lowered her gaze. So what do I do? Clay stepped closer, voice low but firm. You get strong. You learn. And when they come, if they come, you'll be ready. Her eyes met his, something sparking in them. Fear, yes, but something more. Resolve. That night, Clay showed her how to load the rifle. She handled it like it weighed more than her own body. He showed her how to stack kindling, how to tell good water from bad, how to listen for what the trees were saying when the wind shifted. Every lesson was a thread binding them tighter. A week passed. The land began to breathe again, snow giving way to mud, then dry earth. The tracks of elk returned near the creek bed, and birds stitched color back into the morning. But peace does not last long in wild places. It happened in the early dawn. Clay was tending the fence line, scouting for broken posts, when he saw the first sign, hoof prints. Fresh. Too fresh. He dropped to one knee, touched the indent. Heavy horses. 2. No wagon. No shoes on the hooves. Riders meant business. He returned to the cabin fast, breath sharp in his chest. They're coming, he said the moment he stepped in. Juniper was already halfway through lacing her boot. How long? Hour. Maybe less. She looked at him, not with panic but with clear, collected focus. Then we don't wait. They moved quickly. Clay handed her a knife for her belt and double-checked the rifle. He grabbed the saddlebag he kept packed for bad days and slung it over his shoulder. They didn't have time for goodbyes or regrets. Just a plan. They left through the back trail, the one hidden behind the shed and masked by overgrown brush. Clay had cleared it once to escape a wildfire. Now it might save them again. Juniper kept pace, though each step cost her. Clay didn't look back until they reached the ridgeline. He turned then and froze. 2 riders had reached the cabin. One dismounted and kicked in the door without hesitation. The other circled the house, rifle drawn. Juniper touched Clay's arm. Do you know them? No, he said. But I know what kind of men they are. They watched the smoke curl from the chimney. One man tossed something inside. Minutes later, flames licked through the window pane. Clay's fists tightened. They want to burn away the truth. Let them, Juniper whispered. They'll find ashes. Nothing else. Clay nodded. They turned and disappeared into the trees, the firelight dying behind them. But in Clay's mind, something had ignited. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about justice. For Lorna. For Liza. And now, for Juniper. They wouldn't run forever. But they'd live long enough to choose when to stop. And when they did, someone was going to answer for trying to bury the living. The forest offered no paths, only choices. Every step Clay and Juniper took sank into damp moss or crunched over fallen pine needles, swallowed by the hush of early spring. They moved in silence, bound by the shared knowledge that a wrong turn wasn't just a delay, it could be a death sentence. The men who burned the cabin weren't the kind to give up after one failed search. Clay led, always listening. Juniper followed close behind, steady despite the fatigue threatening to drag her down. She hadn't complained once. Not when her boots blistered, not when the cold bit through her shawl, and not even when her legs trembled from the climb up the ridge. She was different now. Hardened by fire. Sharpened by betrayal. Each hour in the woods chipped away the girl who'd been left for dead and revealed something tougher underneath. By mid-morning, they reached a narrow canyon that cut like a wound through the land. A river rushed below, fast, swollen by snowmelt. Clay scanned the ridge opposite them. He saw a flicker of motion. A bird? No. Something heavier. He grabbed Juniper's arm and pulled her into a hollow beneath a rock ledge. They waited. Seconds stretched. Then a figure appeared on the far ridge, one of the riders. He held binoculars, scanning the canyon, searching with a predator's patience. Juniper held her breath. Clay whispered, "They're tracking us." "How?" she mouthed. "Same way I tracked elk before the war. You don't need fresh prints, just patterns. Campfire smoke, broken limbs, disturbed brush. They know we didn't just vanish." "We can't keep running," she said quietly. "No," Clay agreed. "We don't." That night, they didn't light a fire. They ate cold jerky and shared a canteen of melted snow. Clay outlined the map in dirt, where the canyon led, the ridgelines, the narrow choke point he remembered from an old logging path. "If they're following us, we make it cost them." Juniper didn't flinch. "I won't hide again." Clay looked at her and saw not just resolve, but something else, leadership. The kind that didn't come from title or training, but from enduring what should have broken her. They spent the next day setting the ground. Clay rigged a snare trap with thin wire and branches near the narrowest pass. Juniper dug shallow ditches and covered them with twigs and dead leaves, just wide enough to break a horse's stride. Every moment was spent in motion, both of them silent, focused, a team forged not by time but necessity. By nightfall, they had chosen their stand, a ridge overlooking a funnel of rock where the canyon narrowed into a steep defile. It was perfect. High ground. One path in. No path out unless the enemy turned back. They settled in behind a line of fallen logs. Clay adjusted the rifle scope with practiced hand. Juniper kept her knife close. And then they waited. The moon climbed high, silvering the forest in bone-white light. Hours passed. A twig snapped in the distance. Clay raised the rifle, heart hammering. The sound came again, closer now. Hoofbeat. 2 riders. Just like before. He whispered, "On my mark." Juniper nodded. Her hand rested on a smooth stone, ready to throw and draw attention if needed. Not a gun, not yet. Clay's rifle was their only shot before it turned to chaos. The riders moved slowly, cautious but not careful enough. Clay exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like thunder through the canyon. One rider toppled backward off his horse, rifle clattering to the rocks. The other spun and returned fire blindly, but Clay and Juniper were already ducked low. Shouts echoed. Then silence. Clay peeked out. The surviving man had dismounted and was crouched behind his fallen companion's horse. He was yelling something, but the wind scattered his words. Then he raised his hands. "Don't shoot." Clay hesitated. Juniper's eyes locked on his. "Come out slow," Clay shouted. The man stepped forward. Middle-aged, hard lines etched into his face, a revolver still holstered but hands open. "I didn't sign up for this," he said. "I just ride for pay." "You lit that cabin on fire," Juniper said, voice sharp as frost. "I was told she was dead," the man spat. Told to find proof and clear the land. I didn't know she'd been buried. Juniper stood up fully. The moonlight caught her hair, her eyes, the fury in her posture. And if you had known? The man didn't answer. Clay stood beside her now, rifle steady. Tell me who gave the order. The man swallowed. Franklin Whitlock. Her cousin. Said she was a burden. Claimed the land was his by inheritance. Wanted her gone. Juniper flinched but didn't break. And what about you? You just went along with it. I needed coin. Didn't ask questions. Clay's voice dropped. Now you'll answer one. He lowered the rifle barrel an inch. Go back, Juniper said. Tell Franklin you found the grave. Make it convincing. And if you say a word otherwise. Clay took a step forward. You'll be the one they bury next, he finished. The man nodded, backed away, mounted up, and vanished down the trail. They watched him go until he was swallowed by shadow. Clay finally let out a breath. Juniper did too. The next morning, they buried the man Clay had shot. They didn't know his name, but Juniper insisted on marking the grave with a stone. He made his choice, she said, but so did we. They hiked west, toward the edge of the territory, toward a place Clay had heard of, a settlement where war veterans and widows built lives far from the reach of men like Franklin Whitlock. It wasn't a promise, but it was a possibility. As they walked, Clay handed Juniper the rifle. You'll need to learn to shoot. She raised an eyebrow. I already did. He smiled. You'll need to get better. She looked at him, a small grin forming. Then teach me. They moved together, step by step, the forest thinning with every mile. The wind changed. The sun rose higher. And behind them, in a forgotten corner of the frontier, the ashes of what was meant to be her grave still smoldered. But Juniper lived. She'd opened her eyes to a world that tried to end her and chose to walk back into it, stronger, sharper, unyielding. And beside her, a man who thought he'd buried his own heart had found it again, beating not in his chest, but in every act of kindness, every shared silence, every mile walked beside someone who refused to stay buried. Their story wasn't over. It had just begun. If this story stirred something in you, if you felt the weight of survival, of standing tall when the world tries to crush you, then share it. Like the video. Leave a comment. Subscribe for more stories of grit, of love found in the ashes, of lives reclaimed against all odds. Because sometimes the ones left for dead come back to lead the way. Certainly. Here's Section 4, written with a clear, cinematic narrative, dramatic tension, and precise word count of exactly 1,200 words. They reached the edge of the frontier at dusk, where the land rolled into golden hills and the trees thinned like a curtain parting for a final act. Juniper stood at the crest of a bluff, wind tugging at her shawl, eyes fixed on the speck of a settlement far below. Smoke rose from chimneys in soft curls. Faint laughter echoed up from a barnyard where children played and lanterns blinked to life one by one. It wasn't a big town, just a cluster of homes and a chapel, but it had a heartbeat. That alone made it different from everywhere else she'd known. Clay stood a few paces behind, watching her with quiet intent. Since the night in the canyon, she'd said little. But she didn't need to. Her silences were no longer hollow. They were filled with thought, with purpose. And grief, always the grief, but now folded like an old letter she kept close, no longer the storm it had once been. Last outpost before the mountains, Clay said. Place is called Dove's End. Juniper gave a small smile. Hope it's not an omen. They say it got its name from a woman who refused to flee during a war raid. Stayed behind. Saved a dozen children by hiding them in the root cellar. She died, but not one kid was harmed. She looked at him. So it wasn't her end. It was the beginning. He nodded. They made their way down, legs heavy but steady. The road was rough, more wagon ruts than trail, but it led somewhere. That was more than Juniper had hoped for the week before. They passed an orchard blooming with pink blossoms and an old sawmill that leaned like a tired giant against the hillside. When they reached the main square, all eyes turned to them. Two strangers walking out of the wild always raised eyebrows. A child dropped her skipping rope. A man pushing a wheelbarrow straightened. But no one reached for a rifle. That, Clay took as a good sign. A woman in her 40s approached, apron dusted with flour, hair pinned high. She looked Juniper up and down, then Clay, then back again. "You folks been through something." Juniper replied, "You could say that." The woman held out her hand. "I'm Ruth. I run the bakehouse." "Juniper," she said, hesitating a second before adding, "and this is Clay." Ruth didn't flinch. Didn't ask for details. "We got space above the shop. You need food, there's stew on. Room costs 2 days' work, no more." Clay stepped forward. "I can chop wood." "I bet you can," Ruth said, then turned to Juniper. "And you?" Juniper straightened her spine. "I'll do whatever's needed." "Good. The garden's been neglected. You know how to prune tomatoes." "I'll learn." With that, they were no longer strangers. Just people with jobs to do. That night, they ate stew by a fire that crackled with a homely sort of defiance. It didn't feel like safety. Juniper wasn't foolish enough to believe in that word anymore, but it felt like a pause. A breath. And in that breath, something unfamiliar stirred, the beginning of trust in others again. In the following days, Clay fell into the rhythm of the town. He split logs at sunrise, helped raise a fence post by noon, and sat on the porch at twilight mending saddle straps for a man who'd lost the use of his right hand. He never spoke of war, or of the canyon, or of the body they buried beside the pine tree. But every now and then, when Juniper brushed past, he'd glance her way with a quiet question in his eyes. Not if she was okay. He knew she wasn't, but whether she wanted company in her not okayness. She did. Juniper spent her days in the dirt, planting seeds with calloused hands, wiping sweat from her brow, and letting the earth remind her she was still alive. She learned to dig irrigation ditches and wrestle stubborn roots, and chase crows away from the lettuce beds. Each task, however small, anchored her. The nightmares came anyway. Sometimes she woke with a gasp, fists clenched, her body bracing for flames that no longer burned. Clay never spoke when it happened. He just sat near her, silent, until her breathing steadied. Once, he handed her a cup of tea he'd left warming on the stove. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Weeks passed. The townsfolk began to talk about her less like a mystery and more like a neighbor. Ruth taught her to bake rye bread. A boy named Eli showed her how to sling a lasso, though she never got the hang of it. And then one morning, while hauling water from the well, a horse she didn't recognize nickered from the corral. It was her mare. The same one she thought lost in the fire. Clay had found her weeks ago. Nursed the animal's scorched leg. Trained her to trust again. He hadn't said a word about it. Juniper buried her face in the mare's neck and let herself weep. Spring settled in full. With it came green fields, longer days, and a letter addressed to Dove's End. Clay opened it on the porch, eyes narrowing as he read. When he folded it, his jaw was tight. "Franklin Whitlock is coming," he said. Juniper didn't flinch. Alone? No. But not with an army. Just lawyers and men who think land is taken by parchment. She looked at the fields, at the children laughing in the square. "Then we make it clear this place isn't for sale." He nodded. "He might challenge your ownership. Claim you're not in your right mind after what happened." "I was buried," she said, voice iron. "I came back. That's all the proof I need." The day Franklin arrived, dressed in black like he was headed to his own funeral, Juniper stood in the center of the square. She wore no makeup, no frills, just a work shirt stained from soil and boots scuffed by miles of hard road. Her mare stood behind her, calm, watchful. "I have documents," Franklin announced, waving a sheaf of papers. "Proof of inheritance." Juniper took one step forward. "You want this land? You'll have to fight for it. Not with pens. With truth." A murmur swept through the crowd. Ruth stepped beside her. Then Eli. Then Clay. Franklin stared. You think these people will protect you? They don't need to, she said. I protect myself now. In the end, he left. Not because he was defeated, but because he saw something he hadn't expected, strength in the one he buried, and solidarity in those he underestimated. The law may take time to catch up, but the town had already made its judgment. That night, as lanterns glowed across the settlement and music played from a battered fiddle on Ruth's porch, Juniper and Clay stood beneath a sky heavy with stars. You ever think you'd make it here? Clay asked. No, she said honestly. But I didn't do it alone. He looked at her, eyes soft. Neither did I. For the first time in years, Juniper laughed. Not because something was funny, but because something was finally right. The land around them no longer felt like a place to run from. It felt like a place to build. And build they would.